Welcome to Driving Alpha, where we feature our friends, the outperforming investors who demonstrate their path to driving alpha or outsized investment returns. We're Alpha Partners, where we partner with 1,000 early-stage venture firms as their opportunity capital to invest in their best companies. Driving Alpha is supported by Affinity, provider of the CRM for the private capital relationship economy. Affinity knows who has the best relationship with the right startup. Affinity knows. Learn more at affinity.co/driving alpha.
Hi, I'm Steve Brotman, the managing partner at Alpha Partners. Welcome to Driving Alpha, where we explore the strategies of stories behind the world's most influential venture capitalists. Today, we're joined by Francisco Gimenez, a partner at 8VC, a firm founded by Joe Lonsdale after his success with Palantir. I think he started, 5 or 6 unicorns, and dedicated to using entrepreneurship to solve the world's most difficult problems. Quite a thesis there. Francisco's journey is a testament to the power of interdisciplinary expertise. He earned his BS in electrical engineering and computer sciences at UC Berkeley and went on to get a PhD in biomedical informatics at Stanford. Before joining, he served as resident data scientist at Formation 8, working hands-on with portfolio companies to strategize, prototype, and recruit for data-driven products. At 8VC, Francisco has been instrumental in shaping the firm's vision in the biosciences arena. And among some of those companies are Big Hat, Unlearn AI, Seleno, and they incubated Cambion and Lattice. And I'm super excited to dive into some of those companies. Francisco is recognized not only for his technical abilities, but for his abilities to spot and nurture the next wave of industry transforming startups. Get ready for an insightful conversation with Francisco Gimenez of 8VC right here on Driving Alpha. So welcome, Francisco.
Thanks, Steve. It's lovely to be here. I don't do an enormous amount of podcasts, but I really enjoyed all the conversations we've had over the years. It's always been really fun. So happy to join here.
Excellent. Partially this podcast is inspired by those conversations. So great to have you, and thanks for joining us. So one fun thing I like to start off with is I went through your bio, but I'd love to hear how your entrepreneur journey led you to Formation 8 and then 8VC. People don't necessarily wake up and say, "Oh, I got my PhD. Let's go into venture capital." They're usually kind of focused on, a whole bunch of stuff. So I'd love to hear more about that.
It was never the plan, not a career planner. My wife is a writer, and so there's 2 kinds of writers. They're called planners and pantsers. Planners will outline the whole story, and then pantsers just write by the seat of their pants. And so I'm a pantser as it pertains to my career so far. I started in computer science just because I loved computer science, and that was in 2005 when it was kind of hard to believe, but it was considered a terrible field to enter because of the dot-com crash and outsourcing and scares and everything. And I think it was the lowest enrollment that Berkeley had over the years, or at least in that dip. But I fell in love with the idea of AI then, which was also considered a scam field. And I think the one thing I had going for me was kind of like a hipster about cool technology. And so I went there, honestly, I loved the intellectual knowledge, but, didn't do particularly well because I just didn't have a mission in my work. And so I took some time off at Cal. I actually went to UCSF, and that's when I worked in the gene therapy lab for Parkinson's disease. And that was really formative window. It was funded by Andy Grove when he was writing all those articles about how biology is stupid. If they just worked like engineers, they would be so much better. And so they hired a computer scientist like me just to satisfy whatever requirements he had. And I think biology is a very different field than engineering and computer science, but it was fantastic to be able to get that opportunity to work with that group. And so I fell in love with it, and I fell in love with image analysis and AI and image analysis. And so I went to Stanford in 2010 to do that in the biomedical informatics program. That was also a backwater field. Anybody who was in image analysis in 2010 knew that it was basically just a duct tape and bubble gum, and nothing ever worked in production. And I was, again, lucky enough to be saved by AlexNet in 2012, which basically just revolutionized the field. And to be at Stanford when that was happening was really special. I think we were one of the first say, medical imaging groups to get a GPU from NVIDIA, and we just emailed them and said, hey, can we have one? One of, my proteges there wrote one of the earliest papers using AlexNet and deep learning in mammography, and that was really, really cool. And so continued to fall in love with that and work hard. And just midway through, I did the same thing. I said, I want to see a little bit of rest of the world. And so I didn't know how to get a job or an internship or anything. And I had a friend who said, let me just introduce you to a couple folks. I think that's kind of the benefit of going to Stanford. And I got hooked up with Formation 8 at the time, which was Joe's predecessor fund when he was doing a lot in data science and data engineering in his smart enterprise thesis, which we call vertical SaaS now. And it was supposed to be just a summer internship. Really, it was just, I like the idea of learning about entrepreneurship because you just see it from a distance, but it was hard to intuit it. And really just loved it. I got lucky enough to work on some interesting projects that were successful. And then they asked me to stick around part-time while I finished my PhD. And when 8VC got started, they asked me to join the team as a data scientist and then quickly just moved me onto the investment team. And I've been here ever since. I think just following whatever I kind of think is cool has been helpful for me, at least.
Wow. Well, with the starting point, solving the world's most difficult problems, that's quite the gauntlet. And just noting, what you're talking about AI 15 years ago, image scanning, all that stuff, GPUs. These are all things that were way out there on the fringe. Even 4 or 5 years ago, they were pretty fringy. What's interesting at Alpha is we've done, I think, 3 or 4 health tech deals, which you and I talked about, just because the vortex of opportunity is just so damn big in the life sciences arena to apply technology to everything from just in terms of process and applying knowledge that we already know. It sounds like you're very much a visionary early on in your career, way before anyone else really was focused on this. What's exciting you the most in this whole arena that we're a part of? You mentioned some of these companies and you've incubated some companies. What's getting you the most amount of excitement lately?
I'll have one quibble. I don't know if I was ever a visionary. I just worked on things that were really, really interesting to me personally. And look, I've worked on plenty of things that were interesting to me and didn't manifest as anything. So but if anything, I probably lacked a little bit of the vision. I should have bought a bunch of NVIDIA stock in 2012.
And you'd been retired by now, right?
Yeah, exactly. Should have been pushed just to invest in OpenAI when I saw the first, we were one of the first groups to get access to GPT-3. It was summer of 2020. And then there's the Slack group where Brockman would give you access to things. And I think there's a lot that I love and see and love to play with. But I think it's great to be a visionary VC. There's some great ones out there. I think, though, it's better to be a VC who recognizes visionary founders and have them teach us about the future because they're the ones who have to do this sort of black magic of inventing it. So I think that's hopefully where I'm leaning it to, as opposed to trying to be the thought boy.
I think that's a really good point. Are there any things that pops out as you're talking to entrepreneurs? Like, is it being more of an artist and looking up on the wall and saying, wow, that guy's super visionary?
So, I think this is my personal perspective. I'll answer your original question, what's exciting me. But I think for me personally, I would say the companies I love to invest in are ones where they're tackling a really important problem with a large market that's really hard, just really, really hard. And if they succeed, they would be an N of one company and really unique and only in class. Now, that sounds pretty generic, right? Everybody would say that. But I think the counterpoint there is, I'm maybe less inclined to invest in companies where there's several and I have to pick the best one. And I have partners here who are really fantastic at that, right? So I'm really glad we have different sort of investment styles. But, I think maybe I was seeing Delian tweet the other day about like how Ramp was started when Brex had already raised 300 million. I don't know if that would have been a deal that I would have recognized.
No, we missed it personally. It's just so it's sort of it's definitely on our anti-portfolio list. But, typically in tech, it's often the case that the category leader stays the category leader. It's rare that they're surpassed. I mean, obviously Google was the 15th search engine to enter that sector, right? So it is possible, but your focus is more one of one.
Yes, it's so insane or so creative that nobody would even think to start this company. And I think that's what gets me really excited. I think Unlearned is kind of like the canonical example of that. At least it's further along that I can speak about, where The idea of using digital twins to simulate what a patient would look like in a placebo arm of a trial so that we can eliminate the placebo arm of a trial. It's just nobody was thinking about doing that. There are variations of how people were thinking about reducing trial recruitment, but just really just simulating, putting a patient on a cancer or say Alzheimer's drug and simulating what they would have looked like. So we only have to, recruit half of the trial and we don't have to put anybody on a placebo. I remember when I was doing diligence calls with pharmas, they were just like, there's no way this will work. This is insane. And then my follow-up question was like, but what if it did work and it was approved? And they'd be like, well, I'd be fired for not using it. And I think that was like the perfect encapsulation of a deal that I love to do is there's no way it'll work, but if it does, I have to use it. And that's kind of what I think about as an N of one company and tackling a really difficult problem or kind of an obscure problem. I think a lot of people come to me and I get really excited when people teach me about, hey, there's this massive area of spend or there's this massive area of biology that's unrecognized or unloved. But if we do it, it's pretty transformative.
Interesting. Is there anything, so it's mostly more thesis driven, more like just the direction and the vision of that founder into what they perceive might be a whole new world?
Yeah, I mean, stage-wise, yeah, right? Because, right, if it's in the early stage, there's a great founder, there's a really interesting problem, and there's kind of an existence proof or a theoretical solution that we can agree would possibly tackle that problem is maybe one way to view it. At least if I'm like looking back at the things that I've done that seem to have been working, that's what manifested. Starting with, for example, interesting technology, maybe finds a solution, but frequently it doesn't. And so I think it's really, if you start with a problem, then, and you keep that as kind of the guiding principle of the company, more often than not, we find a way through. And I think that's honestly something I've learned from Joe. If you really just sit down with him, Joe thinks about the world in terms of problems to solve and that companies are the vehicles to solve those problems.
Interesting. You mentioned great entrepreneurs. And I mean, I'd think that a great entrepreneur with some of these, I'd hate to use the word kooky, but N of one things, it's sometimes hard to distinguish, right? And especially, I mean, it certainly helps that you got your own PhD in that and have a undergrad in computer science. So like that sort of helps you navigate that world because there's some folks that just want to research. They just want to, that's all they really want to do. And what's your thought on those folks forming companies? Like, do you need to pair them with somebody else? Is it usually a group? Is it a team? Is it a single founder? So I'm just sort of curious because I've wandered the halls of some of these universities, and I'm not a bioscience investor, but even just trying early in my career, I just felt like I just couldn't find those people. I couldn't find my entrepreneurial people. Maybe it's different out at Stanford on the West Coast where that's just de rigueur. But SUNY Albany, they're pretty happy being a doctoral student or going on to get, their postdoc and continue to do research. Yeah. So I was just sort of curious. How does the entrepreneur manifest typically? Is it a serial entrepreneur? Is it first time? Is there no pattern? That's okay too.
Look, if we did this interview 5 years ago, I probably would have had a more prescriptive answer. And I think this job has actually dissolved me of theoretical answers here. And so yeah, I think the through line, and I'll borrow a phrase from Rick Klausner, kind of a luminary in oncology, with the head of the NCI, is the co-founder of Altos, which is a longevity company we're invested in. And at least his criticism of the biotech space, and I think this rings well, I think more generally, if we think about deep tech or difficult technologies, is that everybody thinks in terms of projects and not problems, or at least the majority do. And so in biotech, you think about the project of here's this maybe indication, but here's this molecule, and we just have to figure out our checklist to de-risk it in a stage-wise manner. And it's really about, not making mistakes and executing to the plan pre-specified. And then, it's kind of like rolling the dice and seeing where they land, in the sense of like a clinical trial or something. And I think the founders who I have been drawn to are those problem-oriented founders. They fall in love with the problem because there are maybe many ways to attack it. And if you fall in love with the project, you're stuck on a certain way to solve a problem, but if you're attached to the problem, you're going to find any way you can to solve the problem. Maybe the best sort of material on this, or maybe we're probably paraphrasing it, is Paul Graham's essay last year, The Right Kind of Persistence, where he talked about the difference between persistent and obstinate, and summarizes it maybe as obstinate as being attached to the way you're solving a problem, and persistent as being attached to solving the problem. And that small, almost seemingly semantic difference is I think, the huge difference that I've seen manifest. And I think that was probably one of the most interesting insights that I'd read by him. He wrote the founder mode essay immediately afterwards, and that got all the attention. But I think the Right Kind of Persistence essay was possibly one of the most interesting things I think he's written in a long time from my perspective.
That's pretty interesting. And a lot of, I mean, and I don't mean to with a broad brush, but a lot of PhDs, how many of them are equipped with that problem solving mentality and be willing to leave the womb of academia, right? Do you find that to be a problem or not so much?
I don't think it's too much of a problem about enough PhDs, leaving. I think that science teaches you a very specific way of thinking that can have a tension with entrepreneurship. And if you're starting a science-backed company, obviously you need to be able to think like a scientist. That's not to say that you're prevented from it. It's just in science, I think the core perspective is that we have to consistently doubt our findings, and we have to consistently check it for truth. And we really have to hold a healthy skepticism in what we're doing. And I think in entrepreneurship, you have to be incredibly optimistic about your ability to solve a problem. And if science is taught poorly or not taught with a little bit of that notion of optimism in mind, it can kind of drive you into this perspective of like nothing ever works, nothing ever happens, everything has a caveat and whatnot, versus just saying like, I can solve this problem. There's something meaningful here, and I have a reason to believe. It doesn't invalidate you, but it's just a different way of thinking that can be in tension.
Having an engineering background, which is more problem focused versus sort of theory centric, like trying to find new knowledge. Like, have you noticed a pattern there where if there was an engineering training that was helpful or?
Well, we certainly have the tools and mechanisms and sort of talk track for how to teach engineers how to think about entrepreneurship. I think that's what we've been doing for, as an industry for decades now. And I think that could be done a little better with respect to scientists, because, there's plenty of scientists entering in entrepreneurship, but again, it's very project focused. If you have your kind of prototypical, say, life science VC incubated company, it's about, not making mistakes and following the plan, as opposed to this like pivot and iterate and try to figure out how to solve this problem, right? And there's structural reasons why pivot a company 3 times and you have long cycle times for findings, but there's a certain amount of that thinking that I think is not innately trained or inherently trained. And so whereas engineering, it's like, let's say computer science, there were decades spent in sort of the waterfall model of programming, where everybody coded their specific piece and then we like mushed it all together and hoped it would work. And that was, repeatedly shown to be a total failure of how to do anything. And this sort of emergence of agile programming was like, let's build the skinniest end-to-end functional version of a program and then add and layer onto that, because we've just assumed a certain amount of inefficiency and incorrectness. And the only way to solve for that is iteration. And in science, you might say like, here's our big hypothesis. Here's some biomolecular target that we're going after that might have an implication in cancer or something like that. And you just have a longer inherent time to validate that target, to make a molecule, to test it in some kind of different models with increasing fidelity of predictability in human. So iteration is a little harder, but I think we get so backed up in that, where we have this almost waterfall style of biotherapeutic development, where, a company might run up into their sort of big bang experiment of in vivo models and hope it works and have just enough runway to prove that out, as opposed to what we would like to do, which is just frequent, rapid iteration of testing that allows you to de-risk an experiment or a thought process.
So going back to what we were talking about earlier, which is what most excites you today, is there a key a couple companies you might want to talk about, or?
I mean, companies, the ones that you mentioned are ones that are pretty exciting right now. So Big Hat Biosciences is sort of engineering biologics using sort of traditional wet lab approaches and AI approaches for all manner of therapeutic development. And they were, launched as kind of an idea on the back of a napkin in the summer of 2019. And now AI and drug discovery and AI and protein design writ large is a very sort of hypey field, and the foundation models for biology companies and all that other stuff. But I think what they've built is really differentiated and exciting in that space. I think by, number of companies they're partnering with, both publicly stated and then unrevealed so far, and then their internal programs, they were early to what I think is the right way to engineer biologics. And in particular, one of the co-founders, Mark, told me very early on when I was in a board meeting, I was like, how many, say, antibody constructs can we test in a cycle time? Be it like a month, and I was like, is it like thousands, is it hundreds of thousands, of millions, billions? And he said, this is the wrong question. The right question is, what is the latency of our experimental cycle time? Because I would rather have 200 great experiments in 2 weeks than a billion weak experiments in 2 months. And if you truly trust your AI, then those 200 candidates you're putting into experimentation are really compelling. And if you truly trust your active learning framework and your feedback loops, you want to get that readout quickly so that you can optimize over them much more quickly. And so again, it's kind of like this notion of iterative development. They found a way to do it with their platform that I think has really borne out in the accomplishments they've done, both with their partners and internally. And so again, it's kind of like, it's not just bringing computation into the life sciences. Everybody thinks of that when they chat with me. They're like, what about AI drug discovery, blah, blah, blah. But I really think it's about like bringing engineering principles, the good parts of engineering principles we've learned in software companies into the life sciences. I think that is actually the core component, an important piece. So I think Big Hat is kind of a canonical example of that in the therapeutics landscape. Seleno is, I think, finally had a minimal amount of press. They've been in stealth for a few years, but it's basically all the sort of greats came out of Illumina building out, novel tool systems. And they're building out a really cool box that allows you to do cell biology, manipulation, and characterization at a kind of an unprecedented depth, allowing you to look at a single cell and run multiple assays on that individual cell and then expand that to cell-cell interactions, groups of cells and everything. And just this promise of what if, I like to joke is like, what if cells were, the size of soccer balls and we were actually able to manipulate them and move them around like we do like engineering? Maybe a very reductivist perspective of mine is like, look, if cells were just larger, we'd be able to do a lot of science a lot more easily. A lot of our rate limiters is just the fact that like, even just to see what's going on, we have to do an enormous amount of work. And even just to manipulate them in a certain fashion, you have to do an enormous amount of work. And they just give us those tools to almost be able to manipulate cells with high fidelity and see them and run multiple assays on them. And I think that as we see more and more tooling in biological foundation models and a lot of the AI systems that are really starting to bear early fruit here, we quickly will move into a regime where we have to have more fine-tuned control of the data we generate for these systems. And I think the analogy I give, though, there's kind of debate about this, is Tesla versus Waymo. Waymo got to kind of full autonomous self-driving first because they had multimodal, signal. They had LiDAR, they had cameras, they had various different things, and they controlled the mechanism for data collection by virtue of having the drivers come in and kind of fill that in. And Tesla was kind of taking what I think is the long-term correct approach, which is let's put a bunch of basic cameras on cars and just scoop in that data from a bunch of our customer drivers. And I think Waymo got to fully autonomous first because they were able to have fine-grained control over that. Now, there's debates about whether in the long run Tesla will win or not. But I think today, at the stage we are with biological foundation models and AI and biology, we need a much more fine-tuned multimodal view into cell biology to really train and refine and honestly evaluate these models better. And I think Seleno is the platform that's going to allow us to do that. So really, really excited about that.
Actually, it just makes me think a little bit Do you feel like your companies are more on the engineering side, or are you doing some basic research? I mean, I'm not a bioscience, investor, but what you just talked about seems like you're doing some pretty basic research or providing tools that other basic researchers can use,
Yeah.
which is typically the domain of like the NIH, right? And government.
So yes and no. I mean, like, look, I've got a larger portfolio of things that are more software. Maybe like our core thesis for our life sciences group is twofold. One is what we call products, and the other we call infrastructure. And products being the sort of end result of life science products, so biotech, diagnostics, devices, in that order. And infrastructure is the enabling technologies that empower the bioeconomy to be faster, more efficient, more productive. And I think that frame that problem statement for us, it's how can we enable more interesting basic science research to translate into people more quickly and more cheaply. So I think that the current state of biotech is a very rational manifestation of a system, but it's not, I think, the best way that we could be. Biotech today is predominantly incubated companies by VC firms that are made to get to sort of a clinical proof of concept that then sell into pharma to fit into and enrich pharma's, constantly at risk revenue models, because when drugs get off patent, they lose essentially that revenue to genericization, which is great. That's the contract that biotech and life sciences has with society. Arguably, the only deflationary part of healthcare is the fact that drugs go off patent and get genericized and drop cost over that 20-year time horizon. So what does that mean for pharma, though, is they have these, blockbuster drugs that end up losing revenue. I think by 2030, there's slated about $400 billion in lost revenue in pharma today off of loss of exclusivity, which is great. Pharma freaks out about this. It's a very big concern for the life sciences groups, but it's great for society. $400 billion of lost revenue means $400 billion in savings for patients. So that's, fantastic, and we want that.
And lots of health benefits to boot, and lives saved and everything else.
Yeah, it's fantastic. I mean, think about like the effect of statins today. They were charged a lot. Now there's so many on market that we can do that, reduce cardiovascular effects. And we think about this of so many drugs over the past. Now, the sort of solution pharma has is like they have all these retained earnings. They have an incredibly low cost of capital from, these drugs that they're selling that are on brand. And they buy biotech companies to replenish their pipeline of products. And so life science VCs are very rational, and they think about, if it takes 15 to 20 years from an idea, from conceptualization into drug approval and commercialization, that's longer than a fund time horizon. And so funds can never build biotech companies off of a promise of cash flows. The system doesn't allow for that. And so instead, they've figured out a really thoughtful way, which is let's get things into clinical proof of concept, and pharma buys these programs when they see evidence. And then pharma really takes those through the really big, meaty phase 3 trials and then commercializes it, which is really the engines that they have that are sort of unparalleled. The best sort of analogy I can bring to tech folks is, Cisco in the Chambers era doing, 150 acquisitions to build out all of their product profile. It's like ex-Cisco employees would leave, start a company and sell it back into Cisco. That's actually very similar to what happened with pharma. Or even, the Instagram acquisition. I think when Systrom left, the Strategery blog post, I think it's Strategery, Ben Thompson's blog, said that Instagram was really good at building the product, but Zuck was really good at building the business of Instagram. And I think that's the right way to think about biotech and pharma, is that biotech's really good at building the product and pharma is really good about building the business on that molecule. Now, that said, that manifest is something that I think is a detriment to society, which is if we have 20 to 25 really truly acquiring pharmas, then we only have 20 to 25 CSOs, chief scientific officers, really determining which diseases we're going to cure over the next 10, 20 years. And it's got to be on that pharma time horizon and talk track. So we end up with a lot of biotechs that go after the same targets that are considered validated on topic. Right now, there's maybe 1 trillion obesity companies today, and then there's 1 trillion ADC companies, and target crowding is massive. Like, I think somebody was giving me a statistic about like how 80% of pharmas have overlapping targets that they're going after. And there's a big debate in the sort of life sciences community as to whether that's good or bad. And I'm kind of more in the, that's not very good. But the right way to solve that is we have to push innovation down and decentralize it, which means we cannot have the barrier to drug innovation be pharma decision making. It'd be like saying like all novel internet products have to go through Google and Facebook and Amazon. And it's just crazy if you say it that way. And so how does a biotech bring their innovation all the way to patients? And that means that we have to be able to take a drug from conceptualization through commercialization in under 10 years. And specifically 10 years because that's a VC funded time horizon. Ideally, it's something closer to 7 or 8 so that they can actually generate cash flows and we can figure out, an exit based on revenue-based fundamentals. And if we do that, I think we allow for more founder-led biotechs. We allow for more scientists to go and build these companies. And I think there's going to be, the cost of capital necessarily drop if we don't need to wait, 15 years for approval, but 7 or 8. We bring in more investors who I think sit on the sidelines or concerned or worried about this because they can think about, cash flows at the end of it. Like people say tech VCs are scared of biotech, but like tech VCs are investing in flying cars, nuclear energy and quantum computers and all this other stuff. Like they have no problem with it. It's just like the problem in biotech is that no biotech CEO thinks about the P side of a P&L. And tech VCs, like businesses that make money. That's how compounders work. And so
It does provide a little bit of a discipline, though. It's hard to hide that you don't have revenue. Whereas in a biotech, you can kind of mush look I'm a non-biotech investor, but I find it super interesting. And as I mentioned earlier, we have a lot of companies that intersect. In fact, my biggest win in my life, my career, early win was a company called Metadata, and it just shortened, it's electronic data capture. It basically removed accounting and paper from the system. So we saved a year out of the life. So I can deal with that. But, doing what you do is pretty remarkable. Internally, like, I can't imagine you guys all are bioscience focused. Is it pretty much you and Joe make a call or is it each partner makes their own call in terms of deployment?
No, we have a sort of IC voting structure, investment committee voting structure. So I think we are very much a team focused at, there's a partner that's going to lead any given decision, an investment decision. We have a team that's meant to make that partner's decision better. And sometimes they vote against the deal and it doesn't pass. That's, tough. But I think the point is not to find ways to poke holes in somebody's investment, but to make sure that we're finding a way to get to yes that is well articulated. And if there's disagreement, at least we all agree on the points of disagreement. And, I think some of our best investments have been the most split votes. And I think when I talk to other VCs at different firms,
Even if there's a split vote, you're comfortable. It doesn't have to be unanimous. It can be kind of a split vote.
yeah, honestly, our best investments have been split votes.
A lot, my sister's, and sorry to call her out, but she's got her PhD at Johns Hopkins and she's impacted by some of the cutbacks or was worried about some of the cutbacks happening there. Do you have a hot take on, is that going to be, Armageddon for the US sciences? It can't necessarily be great. Is there a silver lining? Is this going to encourage people to get more? Is it going to drive more? I was just curious, like what, from your perspective, from the venture side, how is this impacting your universe?
So we've written a piece about kind of our recommendations to the NIH. So I'm just kind of speaking to those points. But I think that there's clearly a difference between what is stated and sort of the initial position and then what actually manifests. I think that reduction of indirects, and so indirect financing, of course, means that for every dollar that you get as a grant, there's a percent above that amount covers kind of, basic like rent and stuff. And so if I get $1 of a grant, maybe if there's like a 50% overhead, then my actual grant is for $1.50. It's important to think about that because it's added on top. It's not 50% of my grant is the indirect, and you have to go into why. Like the ones with massive indirects, like 87, 90%, those tend to be academic research centers with hospitals, right? And so those hospitals are paid for via those indirects. It's not just say administrative bloat. There's a lot of administrative bloat, don't get me wrong. But when we see these cartoonishly large numbers, you realize there's a hospital attached to that entity that's being paid for and paying for a lot of healthcare. An indirect socialized healthcare, if you will. And so I think that indirects could be done better. There's a lot swept under the rug for the sake of just saying it's easier this way. Like a lab never has to think about paying rent because that is swept up in the indirect, or paying for power or whatnot. Whereas if you're biotech, you have to pay all of these things explicitly. But the problem is when the indirect is a straight across the line percentage, the lab doesn't get a chance to negotiate that or think about finding cost saving measures. And maybe like, of those grant dollars I bring in, how much is coming back to me? It's almost like federal taxes that go back to states, right? Like, are you a net, tax producer or a net tax receiver from the federal government? I think of that way in indirects. And so in general, I kind of view as more decentralized is better, reduced indirects, and making the costs that go into indirects explicit indirect costs is probably the right way to go, modulo up to some sort of limits here. The idea of cutting the NIH budget by 40% would catastrophically destroy science in America. And it's insane. But I also think that was a headline number. And I think in the manifestations of what we're seeing in the budget, that's not necessarily happening. But, the NIH, they have a large budget, but they only have about 10% wiggle room of that budget in any given year because they give out grants on multi-year time horizons. And so if you were to cut it by 10%, that basically has eliminated all your free spend and would just cover the sort of specified costs. But if we go down there, we're actually cutting into people's existing grants, which is obviously what's happening. So I think that American innovation is possibly one of the most impressive crown jewels that we have. And so cutting it is crazy. It'd be like saying, like, in the Enlightenment, if we decided that we wanted to cut all science spending for one of the most important periods of innovation in human history. And I think the one thing that America has consistently done well is, no matter how many mistakes we make on many policy or whatever issues, is like we always innovate our way out of a paper bag. And so gutting innovation, and that's not just NIH, right? Like this is a message to all other sort of innovative government sectors. And I don't think our government actually wants that. I think, there's a bone to pick and there were mistakes made, certainly, but I think this is a very important sector of our economy. And honestly, just to be a human, right? Like it's inspiring to say we live in a country that has the best science in the world.
Right. But yeah. So like you mentioned, this is sort of backdoor socialized medicine now. Because, shouldn't we just be explicit about that? It's like, hey, here's a grant to help poor people, as opposed to like saying it's science. Is that like the best way to do it? Is that what you're saying? Or
Yeah, maybe socialized medicine is too hot of a take, but a hospital, right? Anybody can show up to any hospital and get care. That is, backdoor socialized medicine. That's not just an academic medical center, right? And they're ethically not allowed to refuse people because they can't pay. And I think the added part of academic medical center is they can do innovative treatments on things that don't have interventions or in diseases that are considered rare that there's not a market demand for. And I think that that's really important to allow for, is that when you go to a CHOP or a Stanford Medical or UCSF, you're getting the most innovative treatment if you have, a rare disease, or if you have a cancer with unmet need that nobody knows how to intervene on. And you can't just do that anyway. And there's no market need for that. But in curing that, enabling physicians to cure those diseases, or at least try to, we learn about disease biology and fundamental disease biology. Those are the front lines of clinical research, not just biological research. And yeah, like that's paid for under these indirect costs in NIH, but like I want that to be paid for. It's not like, we're giving everybody kind of a socialized medicine. It's just like,
anything you would, you've been doing VC for a while now, anything that you wish you knew when you started out that you know now that you'd like to share?
I think that one of the trickiest and most important things to do as a VC is just developing a good eye for great founders, or great eye for great founders. There's a lot of great scientists. There's a lot of great programmers. There's a lot of great, and they start companies, and we want them all to do that. But if you're investing in the early stage, if you just get to choose one skill It's identifying great brain, great founders. And that's just, some people kind of can do it natively, like clearly Peter Thiel or Paul Graham, for that matter, just clearly had that eye. I think I saw a great interview with Sam Altman where he said at YC they train that in people and it takes a couple of years, but they feel like it's trainable still. And I think that it's hard to say you could speed run that, but that is, I think, probably one of the most important reps, to the point where it's like new associates should be spending as much of their time with the best founders in a portfolio and a fund, and just meeting them and just developing a gestalt for what makes them great and meeting great founders. I think that'll go probably the longest way. But also, I spent my whole career up until that point studying like AI and technology. So maybe like if I had a great eye for founders and no idea how to understand technology, I would have been saying the opposite. So
My son's actually taking his first steps, without his dad's help in venture. And I've been telling him that this is a key skill, and he's talking to a couple folks, but it's hard. It's actually kind of hard. It's like the hardest part of our job is sort of weighing founders in a way that you find that edge. And the only way to do it is reps, right? It's like seeing what works, seeing how they work, and every founder is different and they have different edges. Any advice you'd give to a founder?
Whew, man, again, I feel less and less inclined or able to give advice to founders over the years. Besides,
How about founders who want to get in touch with you? What's the best way to approach you?
yeah, I think the oft quote, and I still think the best way, is warm intro from a person that we strongly respect. There's a certain category of people who intro us to a founder and we're immediately looking for ways to say yes. And I take cold intros and cold pitches. Sometimes it's just, if I have to just sift through the massive prioritization queue, the more you are well referenced and recommended by people we care about, I guess the more we are trying to find a way to invest in you. And I think Joe said something really interesting once, which is like, it's almost like manufactured two orthogonal introductions from people we respect. I think that is, maybe to myself, but I think it's just advice we give to founders pitching elsewhere. If two totally different people say this is the smartest person I've ever met, you're probably going to get invested in. So at least at the very early stage.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Francisco Gimenez, partner at 8VC. Thank you so much for your time today, and look forward to continuing our chat soon.
Awesome. Thanks, Steve.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks for listening to the Driving Alpha podcast, where we host top investors to demonstrate how they outperform the market. Click subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. Driving Alpha is supported by Affinity, provider of the CRM for the private capital relationship economy. Affinity knows who has the best relationship with the right startup. Affinity knows. Learn more at affinity.co/driving alpha.